Hello, welcome to Ancient Philosophy today. My name is John Dunphy, and we're going to go through an argument for God's existence and talk about truth and all that good stuff. So, with that in mind, just want to check my sound. Mind. So, God's existence and about truth and all that good stuff. Okay, we're good. So, I'm going through a book, 2 dozen or so arguments for God's existence by Alvin Plantinga and Trent Doherty. The Plantinga Project. I'm an atheist, so I do not hold that there are good reasons to believe in the existence of God. And I actually argue that there are many good reasons to hold to the non-existence of God. So typically speaking, there are many atheists who do not hold to proving their position. I'll prove my position with good reason. So my position is naturalism. So we're going through the first argument, which is the argument from intentionality or aboutness. Oh, and not really, because the argument from intentionality and aboutness is usually for the soul. But the argument here is for oh no, it is the argument from aboutness. Just the usual argument from aboutness from people like William and Craig is for the soul and stuff like that. So they're not arguing for the aboutness of the mind, but rather what thoughts are. Then they want to argue for a divine mind based on what thoughts are. So first they talk about truth and how truth needs a supreme mind. I disagree because I'm in conclusion with them that truth is mind independent. Let's see here. Something is true only if it represents reality. I agree to that. A proposition can actually prescribe something to be actual as well. So proposition just isn't always necessarily just a representation. So they want to argue from propositions to a divine mind. But we'll go through the argument. So to review, an argument is a premise with a conclusion. Well, that's just one form of argument. There are many forms of arguments. So I want to review that. So typically, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a two-premise argument with a conclusion. So their first argument, or first premise, is there are propositions, non-linguistic entities that are fundamentally true or false in virtue of their representational properties. So they want to say the nature of reality. I agree to that. There are propositions that are non-linguistic. Only thoughts are fundamentally true or false due to their representational properties. Let's see. Only thoughts are fundamentally true or false due to their representational properties. That's true. Propositions are thoughts. Thoughts are not propositions. Thoughts can be propositions. No, thoughts are propositions. If propositions are thoughts, they're either human or divine thoughts. So I have here an existential fallacy. They are arguing, they're adding in quite the assumption here. Not assumption. They're adding in an existential fallacy, which is bringing in divine thoughts. What is divinity is quite the question I have. Premise 5, but there are not enough human thoughts to play in the role of propositions. Premise 6, so propositions are not human thoughts. I changed this to propositions are thoughts, not divine thoughts. So I think it becomes not cogent. Or, not sound. Sound is true. I'm trying to remember. Soundness has to do with the truthfulness of it. Cogency has to do with inductive arguments. Trying to remember if it would be unsound. I'd have to review that. Premise A, if there are divine thoughts, then there is a unique divine thinker. That is a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It's the same thing with adding in this idea of a unique divine thinker. And then their conclusion, therefore, there is a unique divine thinker. So what propositions would actually represent this divine thinker is my question. And you would have to have perfected thoughts. Are there such things as perfected thoughts? I don't think so. I don't think there's any human being with like perfected thoughts. So like this idea of perfection. Now there are many human beings who are perfected in what they do, but this idea of perfection truly is based on the individual who is not God. So this idea of perfected thoughts. So a deist can come in and say, well, okay, perhaps there's just a perfected thinker that just wants nothing to do with human beings. And that is the next conclusion. So for me as an atheist, I'd have to make arguments against deism. So I would have to attack the idea of a unique divine thinker. But perfected thoughts, this idea of perfected thoughts. So we would have to have perfected thoughts in order to have a unique divine thinker is the conclusion. Versus most of my thoughts are incomplete. I have to say that. Uh, so I'd go back to premise 4 and just simply say that there are just human thoughts, not divine thoughts. So this idea of representation, we would need the actuality of real divine human thoughts. And I don't really know any human beings who have unique divine thoughts. So you would have to go to this idea of Jesus Christ, who is a rabbinical teacher, uh, who may or may not have died from crucifixion. Most likely died from crucifixion. I definitely deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But that is a Christian held belief. So people like Gary Habermas argue for the existence of the resurrection and so on. I don't know. I'm not really good at history, just I don't hold to that since I'm an atheist. So let's see here. So why not a collection of divine thinkers? Again, I would just argue that we don't have good reason to hold to this idea of perfected thoughts. I don't know anyone. Now you could accuse me of an argument from ignorance, but I don't know anyone who has perfected thoughts. So like this idea of the image of God simply doesn't seem sound to me. Uh, as someone who I used to be a Christian, uh, I used to hold to the image of God. Now I just simply don't, because I don't think there is good reason to hold that any human being has perfected thoughts. There are many human beings who are perfected in what they do in their arts, but they probably wouldn't claim to be like the image of God or something like that. So why not a collection of divine thinkers? I simply would so you would have to go into polytheism, so you would have to have a collection of perfected beings that if they are perfected, they definitely are messing with people. Many are unique thinkers. So why not just like maybe a unique thinker who isn't perfected? Okay, perhaps. I just only use that word God. So their objection here then is that propositions cannot be accounted for by propositional naturalism. I disagree. So when Saturn, or no, when the planets orbit in their axioms or whatnot, I'm not great at science, but when they do that, they have agency of some sort, and therefore make a proposition. That proposition becomes true through mathematics. So I am an atheist who holds to the prescription of mathematics as well. Many don't because they're materialists. I'm not a materialist. Propositions are claims or assertions. They attribute or predicate properties to or objects. They represent reality or some part of it having a certain character. So we would need propositions that are perfected in human beings in order to have that character. The essence of a proposition is to represent or to actualize. Have truth values and virtue represent reality as being a certain way. Oh, so we would need eternal propositions for God, since God is eternal being. So eternal propositions would be argued for like the prescriptions of mathematics. So I'd argue that the universe indicates that. Now I'm not. I will eventually go into the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence and probably argue for the eternality of the universe. So this idea of perfection, there are many human beings who are perfected that probably won't hold to this argument. That's not a that's not a good reasoning. I take that back. There are many perfected beings in their arts. What I'm doing is just reviewing my notes, so that's why there are some pauses. So this next position is an atheistic position, psychologicalism, which holds that truth values are basically the representation of mental states acted out of some sort. Again, I hold to the objectivity of propositions through mathematics and so on. So I slightly disagree with that. So descriptive propositions would simply be this position of psychologicalism. So proposition is a judgment we make about things. Oh no, some propositions are just simply the judgments of actual events, so they are representations. But then some propositions are just human opinions. I have many opinions of my own. So two very important philosophers, Aquinas and Boethius. Aquinas claims that truth is found primarily in the joining and separating by the intellect. Boethius assigns the rule of fundamental bearers of truth and falsity to propositions, mentales, sentences in the mind that are composed of mental words. So Aquinas would hold that the intellect is a substance and propositions are part of the substance. I think I sort of agree with that. I actually am a substance dualist, so I do hold to the soul. That's my view. I would call it more than opinion. I would call it uh, the proposition I hold to. So I'm not a materialist. Most atheists are materialists from what I've gathered over the years. I've been doing philosophy only for like let's see, like 10 years. Mental states are the fundamental bearers of representational properties. I agree. What are perfected mental states? Okay, acting out the perfection of a proposition, which is true. All human arts are not eternal propositions. So, like, there would have to be a human art that represents an eternal truth. I think of stuff like culture. I don't know if we have eternal culture. So, I would hold to a form of naturalism that culture is a form of it with the soul, and the soul makes that. So, every human being has a soul and is able to act in perfections. Now, this is where the argument from aboutness would come in and say, well, God fulfills that. Well, I don't think human beings are the most perfected beings, yet many human beings are more perfected than others through their efforts of the soul. So, as a naturalist, I would argue that civilization is built upon the human soul, and the human soul is something that's natural to a human being. So, the human soul bears that then and acts out those perfections. Since types are abstract. Well, what kind of types? Again, this idea of eternal types, this idea of eternality, I think would be just an intuition in every human being if we were made in the image of God. Again, so I won't go into much biblical arguments, but like how the Bible argues for Adam and Eve. So inspiring philosophy argues for Adam and Eve, and that there's a culture, society of human beings in the Garden of Eden. Well, if people are made in the image of God, then we would just naturally know God to those eternal truths. And that I would clearly argue isn't true through a form of divine hiddenness as well. I used to be a Christian apologist as well when I used to argue for these arguments too. Propositions represent because agents represent. Finite agents are the only fundamental representers. That is true. Oh, so if we go back to the idea of divinity, what are these divine thoughts that are perfectly acted out? You would have to go to human culture, which is appealed to by apologists, Christian apologists. Again, I argued for the soul and that the soul is true and builds culture through naturalism. And then some places where societies don't exist, they're good culture. And in some places, you need that culture. No, I have two arguments for naturalism as well. TC is TC is committed to the unintelligible claim that propositions represent on their own, independently of minds and languages. So a proposition can definitely be true without a human mind. So it is true, and within mathematics and so on, that a planet revolves around the sun. That is true through the prescriptions of mathematics, which I hold to. Some atheists deny that, which I think they shouldn't, but that's just my view. On TC, that propositions represent is a brute fact, but the result that it is a mystery how they do so. Brute fact. Okay, so a theist would maybe commit to me that my naturalism holds to to a brute fact of the idea of minds just existing. Well, I think it's through the evidence of the soul that the mind exists. So I guess I would have to go with like an Occam's razor. Again, the idea of a divine mind posits quite a lot, and I've given arguments against the idea of a divine mind, of what we would expect. So a Christian would have to argue, well, once upon a time ago, Adam and Eve were perfected through the image of God and through sin. Okay, so that's this idea of Christianity. I won't go into Christianity in this live stream, but I will target that later on. DC offers no explanation of how we come to bear attitudes to propositions, as well as how we are acquainted with and come to know things about them. As a naturalist, I would argue it's just natural for a mind to know the prescriptions of mathematics. So our minds are not eternal. I would definitely hold to that. Uh, the soul is definitely not eternal. So a Christian would argue, well, it was a go until sin. Okay, so everyone sins in his wrongdoing, and God fulfilled that. I don't see that today. Would be my objection. It's a good reply, but I just simply don't see that today. I don't see that perfectedness in Christianity. That's just me then, perhaps. I would argue it's just not me though. I take that back. It borders on the absurd to suppose that an inert, non-spatio-temporal entity could have a part that in itself plays any referential of quasi-referential role. Representation is ultimately the business of beings with intentional capacities, in short, thinkers. I agree to that because every thinker is a limited being without really being a person. So every thinker is a person, and every person picks up representations through what they do and how they think. Again, this idea of a divine mind, where does this come into, and how does that play out with things today? Propositions are representational because of their intrinsic connection to inherently representational cognitive events. So our cognition is where I'm arguing from. I don't think we have the cognition of a divine mind or thinker. So the I would say backslide, if you're not arguing from strict philosophy, would have to be Christianity, which is a different position to Christianity is a philosophical position, so you would have to argue from that. But a lot of it would have to be historical and theological, which theology is a philosophy as well. It's the study of God. Uh, so I still agree with Boethius and Aquinas that the intellect is a substance. So I'm not like a materialist. Since entertaining a proposition is performing it, the intentionality of the act of entertaining is to the intentionality of the proposition itself. So when the soul acts out a certain culture or disposition, those actions should have like an eternal nature to them or a divinity to them, which I would suppose this divine thinker. I just haven't seen that in the sense of um, human culture from what I've studied. Uh, and if you go into this idea of a Messiah, um, there are just many different messiahs in culture too, which would and then many Christians would point. I don't even want to talk about Christianity, but many Christians would point to the Messiah of Jesus Christ. So there are many messiahs too. Uh, and this idea of divine thinkers in culture, which the argument would then be, well, or is this one divine Messiah? And again, you would have to go to history. In a nutshell, propositions represent because the agents that perform them do. Oh, okay. So my thought was the agent, this Messiah, would have to perform them. These Messiahs would still be alive today in a quite actual like way versus just religion. Uh, I may be unaware of that. But that's just my view. It's obvious that human agents judge, believe, desire, and doubt. And it's obvious that these cognitive acts are representational. But if so, then propositions exist and represent. That is true. I don't think I have to comment on that. Oh, so transcendental arguments. I still hold to the prescription of logic. So transcendental arguments, I think, make an existential fallacy uh, of this idea of eternal truths. And if I'm held to an eternal truth, it would be mathematics and logic in the sense of the universe, not a divine thinker. Oh, and the idea is agency. So the universe has agency too. Uh, so where does this divine thinker come into? So I would still use Occam's razor in saying that the universe is eternal in that nature. But I'll have to deal with the Kalam cosmological argument later. Oh, an infinite agent. So we are not infinite agents, but potential agents. So this idea of, oh, I want to go back to transcendental arguments to that I hold to the prescriptions of logic and mathematics, but they are not prescriptive or transcendent against what they describe or prescribe. So an existential fallacy would be in here to imply something above mathematics and logic too, which would be, well, perhaps. I don't think we'd be able to know that, and then therefore don't posit it on a philosophical viewpoint, at least. Finite choice sets are not beyond our cognitive reach, since their elements can be enumerated. What would be our infinite choice as a human being? I guess that choice for a Christian would be to argue, or would be to hold to Christianity. Which, okay, what human being then is an infinite being to hold to Christianity? Finally, finite agents are able to cognize a set of primes by satisfying condition. We cognize a predicate under which all and only the prime numbers fall. I really want to comment on that. It's necessary that an agent satisfy one of the conditions to cognize a choice-only set. What are the eternal choice-only sets? I wouldn't want to go into like Orthodox Christianity. That's more from a historical standpoint. So I'm trying to get from the philosophical standpoints. So, okay, perhaps one would say, well, to be logical would be that way. Well, the universe is very logical, so I choose to be like the universe. I don't choose to be the universe. No possible finite agent satisfies any of the conditions with respect to the only sets. So no possible finite agent cognizes a choice-only set. If no possible finite agent cognizes choice-only sets, then there is no possible finite agent is in a position to entertain singular propositions about them. We condition on grasping singular propositions about sets. Cognizing a set S is necessary for entertaining singular propositions about S. So no possible finite agent entertains a choice proposition. Just seeing where to go from here. So no possible finite agent entertains a choice proposition. I would argue here no possible finite agent entertains an infinite choice proposition, unless you choose to do mathematics then. So infinity would be in mathematics and logic. And since our soul is sort of mathematical and logical and intellectual, we are sort of like that, just not divinity, because divinity would be above logical thinking and so on. We still are finite agents since we are just soul body composites. So you would have to argue something more than a soul body composite. The only other option would be to drop the restriction to finite agents, but then this would not be propositional naturalism. And so what is the restriction of finite agents to represent these propositions of logic and mathematics for the soul? So through culture making, which is evidence, propositional evidence, and uh, inductive evidence for naturalism, that society is created through human souls, through knowing intuitively mathematics and logic. But there's not really this intuition of the divine per se. If there would be, it would be universal. And there's second argument we'll go through, and I'll give my two arguments for naturalism. Propositions represent essentially, only agents represent fundamentally. The universe has agency, I would argue. I'd also argue that the universe has this intellect-like substance through mathematics and logic. So I would hold to not transcendentals. Well, transcendental above me would be like mathematics and logic. And that would be a good point to make. But again, where does this agency comes from? Let's see here. There are propositions that no finite agents entertain. The representation of transcendental propositions is independent of the representation of finite agents. So transcendental propositions cannot depend on finite agents. Therefore, there is an infinite agent. Where does this infinite agent, again, another existential, I would just use the same fallacy of an existential fallacy of an infinite agent. Again, I would also argue that if we are infinite beings, we're not divine beings. We're definitely just finite agents, so definitely argue through culture making. So that's the first argument from intentionality. So they didn't really talk about free will and deliberation. So where does free will come into when it comes to where does free will come into when it comes to agents and so on? Well, I think the universe sort of has like a free will of its own. I wouldn't call myself a pantheist, or perhaps I would have to be. So I have two arguments for naturalism. Let's see here. I want to take these off. So premise one, all propositions are either actual or representative. Premise 2, thoughts contain propositions. The mind is an Premise 3, the mind is an actual accumulation of thoughts. Premise 4 states, or stars are an actual accumulation of atoms. So the mind is something created through mathematics and logic, through this intellectual substance of the accumulation of thoughts. Premise 5, the universe came before the mind. Conclusion, therefore, the universe explains the mind. The mind is very complex, obviously, and is unique. So is the universe, so is a star. Does a star have consciousness? Maybe consciousness, but not agency. I have no idea, too, by the way. That's just a possibility versus adding in a divine thinker. Which deism would be the better position, I would argue. Oh, there are no divine thoughts. All thoughts are wholly mind. Divine thoughts uh, present something more than mind. All thoughts are natural, therefore naturalism is true. So this idea of a divine mind would have to include something more than just finite minds. And my conclusion is naturalism is true. Also, divine thoughts would have to be something more than the mind. So I don't know what this idea of divinity means versus the arguments from transcendentalists for mathematics from the prescriptions of mathematics and logic. I don't understand where this would come into divinity. I'll go through my argument again. So there could be a unique being that knows himself, that perhaps has some explanation. Never mind, I take that back. So, like, you could argue for like a form of deism, but my argument would argue for no divine thoughts. All thoughts are wholly mind. Divine thoughts present something more than a mind. All thoughts are natural. Therefore, naturalism is true. That's my argument for naturalism. Oh, So we would have a category error when it comes to positing divine thoughts. I don't think divine thoughts have anything to do with, well, I don't even know what divine thoughts mean. Uh, because this substance would be mathematics and logical, but we have the universe to explain that. What do I mean by naturalism? It's a good question. I mean the prescriptions of mathematicals and logical truths. So those are two arguments for naturalism. Again, many atheists are materialists, and then many hold to the idea that propositions, or not propositions, that hold that the proposition of atheism is just the mere rejection of theism. I would argue that atheism has plenty of good evidence uh, and reasons to hold to naturalism. I definitely would not hold to materialism. I think that's a false view. But thank you for watching. That's part one. We have 22 parts to go through. But thank you for watching. Leave a like and subscribe.